Namaskar. This is a very special episode of Dil Se. Why is it special? Because on December 26, 2024, Dr. Manmohan Singh departed to his heavenly abode. A very endearing, unassuming, humble, extraordinary son of India. From God to being the Prime Minister of India is a long, long journey. It tells you something about the man, it also tells you something about our democracy. And if you look at the journey of India from 1947 to 2024, and the several prime ministers who served us, starting with Jawaharlal Nehru. When Nehru became prime minister, at that point in time, India was in political turmoil. The British had exploited the economy of this country. They had built some railway tracks, but that was for their exports. There was no industry worth the name. The people who were educated were represented 14 to 16% of the population of the country. So Nehru, in a sense, being part of the freedom struggle, laid the foundations of India, foundations of a free India. Then came Shastri, who served only for about 18 months, unfortunately. Then Mrs. Gandhi came, and I think she was a defiant prime minister. A defiant prime minister, why do I say that? Because when the 7th Fleet came in 1971, when Nixon sent the 7th Fleet, she stood up. She was defiant to the insurgencies that happened within. She was a defiant prime minister. Then we had a few years of Janta rule, and nothing much happened then. Mrs. Gandhi came back. Then Rajiv Gandhi, who believed in technology, so he, in a sense, realized that technology is the way forward and we must embrace technology, but didn't have enough time to actually take that forward. Then we had, after Narasimha Raoji, we had two governments. They lasted for a short while. Then came Vajpayee, who was a collaborative person. He was a cooperative person. He even talked to the opposition. He talked to Pakistan. So he was a collaborative prime minister in a sense. He also tried to build the infrastructure of our country. Then 10 years of Congress government under the Dr. Manmohan Singh. Then, of course, came Modi ji. And his 10 years, we've had an aggressive prime minister. Aggressive in the sense of what's happening in our country. So if we look back and look at all the prime ministers that have contributed to this nation, I would call Dr. Manmohan Singh as a prime minister who built modern India, or laid the foundations of a modern, resurgent India. And that's what we're going to talk about, apart from the fact that he endeared himself to so many wonderful people. But I've got one special person to talk about him today, and that's Dr. Manmohan Singh. Manmohan Singh is a college mate. As you know, he's a Rhodes Scholar, and that's something that was common. That's common with Dr. Manmohan Singh as well. He himself was a Rhodes Scholar. Manmohan went to Oxford, got an MPhil from Oxford after getting a BA honors degree, then worked with the World Bank from 1968 onwards. Then after he came in the 80s, became an economic advisor to the government, became a special secretary to the Prime Minister. And then, lo and behold, Dr. Manmohan Singh asked him to come back to India. And he came back and joined his team, became the finance secretary. And the foundations of a modern and resurgent India were laid with Dr. Manmohan Singh as the Prime Minister and Manmohan as finance secretary. That foundation has served us well. And we'll see and we'll talk about what happened during the years when when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister and Montek was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. Yeah. Thank you.
And I just gave the background to put things in perspective. So what do you think of the man as a man and Prime Minister as a Prime Minister?
Well, look, I've been known him for more than 50 years. And in a way, he was, for me, both an inspiration and a mentor and someone who, towards the end, actually brought me into his critical team. So I've known him for a very long time. And, you know, there's so much written about him in the aftermath of his passing away. All of it is positive. And, you know, a lot of it is personal. Mm-hmm. Personal in the sense it talks about the man.
Yes.
So I think we can talk about his, quote, achievements separately, but it's very important to realize that he was, you know, people use the term humble, and I don't think that's the right term.
Okay.
He was not self-assuming. He was...
Self-effacing, wasn't he?
He almost, to a fault, a bit self-effacing, but essentially, he was not an aggressive, he didn't push himself as the principal actor or anything like that. But, you know, he commanded a huge amount of applause and sort of appreciation, if you like. And people recognized that there's something very special here. I mean, I saw that, for example, in the international framework, which is only one part, because I was his Sherpa when he was Prime Minister for 10 years in the G20. And, you know, these were occasions when different people would come and meet together. And during that period, many things happened in the world that were quite troubling. I mean, the financial crisis of 2008, the Eurozone crisis, and other things. And it was amazing how much respect he commanded in the other members of the G20, all of whom were either presidents or prime ministers.
Obama called him guru.
Yeah, that's what Obama said, that when Prime Minister Singh speaks, yes, the world listens.
Correct.
And I think he spoke rarely, he listened a lot. And I think this is one of the reasons why he was so effective. Because, you know, he never came across saying, I have the solution. He'd always ask people, what are your problems? How do you see it? And the second thing is that in my experience in interacting with him, he always encouraged people to speak up. He didn't take the view that, look, I'm the finance minister and I'm the prime minister and now I've decided, now you do it. I think his view was, look, it's a very complicated world and there are different views and we should hear all of them. And at one stage when he was finance minister under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the big changes were about to happen, he called a whole bunch of secretaries together, okay? And he said to them, we are going to make big changes. And he also said that I need your help. Mm-hmm. Because if I don't have your help, you can probably stop all this. So I want you to help and I need your help. And then he said, I realize that some of you may have ideological reservations about what we are doing. Mm. I respect that. If you do, let me know and we will find you an equally good job somewhere else. But while you're on the team, please join the effort and support. Yeah. Now, you know, for a bunch of secretaries to hear a finance minister
say something
sort of
like
telling them that he needs their help, right, not that this is a crisis, now you do it. Yeah, yeah. And also telling them
this is what we've decided, you've got to implement
not at all.
Yeah.
And this was the defining character of Dr. Manmohan Singh. You could always go up to him and say, sir, I'm not entirely sure that this is right. And he would look at you and argue with you and discuss. And he would take his own decisions.
Right.
But he encouraged people to speak up.
But that's a part of humility, that you're willing to listen to somebody else. I don't mean humble in that sense.
I don't like the term humility. Because, okay. I mean, I'm in favor of being, I'd like to be humble. It's a good thing. But I think it's more a sort of a recognition that you owe it to the system. Since you have power, you owe it to the system to be well informed. I'll give you another instance. 2008, September, Lehman Brothers crisis. The whole world knew that it was going to be a mess. Dr. Manmohan Singh was then Prime Minister. Okay? So he called his team. He called, Chidambaram was the Finance Minister, Governor RBI. Rangarajan was the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. called the finance secretary, of course, called me because I was then deputy chairman of the planning commission and a former finance secretary, and we all sat around and said, what should we do? And we discussed, should we have a stimulus? Shouldn't we have a stimulus? And all of a sudden, Dr. Singh says to me that, where is Raghuram Rajan? Because he knew Raghuram Rajan as an economist. He had been chief economist of the IMF. So kind of from a international perspective, he would be well informed. And I said, so he's gone back to the University of Chicago. So he said to me, get in touch with Raghuram and tell him, we're wondering what we should do, and I want him to advise me.
That's wonderful.
Now, most people would have said that he knew more about economics than most of the rest of us. And the team was pretty knowledgeable. You had Chidambaram, you had Rangara. Forget about the rest of us. He had quite a good team.
Right.
But having seen this team, he also had the thought that, look, he has access to Raghuram, so why not get his view?
Right.
That was the most distinctive thing, I feel.
Even in my interactions with him on any issue that I took to him, actually the art of a conversation is the ability to listen.
Yes, that
was his greatest.
But in his case, it wasn't
attribute.
Just a form. He was inviting different views, because as an economist he knew.
Because unlike Vajpayee, who had the ability to listen, but he didn't say much. But as far as Dr. Manmohan Singh is concerned,
absolutely.
Yeah, he would give his point of view. When I went to him, I remember for my education reforms, he said to me, Kapil, you're taking a tough call. I don't think it's going to be easy for you to get them through. And he said to me, not only will the opposition be against you, but some of the people within the party will also not like what you're doing, right? So be a little careful. And that's the kind of man that he was. Whenever he thought that, things were getting rough, I remember in the telecom sector when this happened, he would call me and said, Kapil, you have to deal with this because there are legal issues involved and there are technology issues involved, and you're the best person to deal with. And he had great confidence. Actually, when he picked up somebody, he supported him fully, or he or she supported him fully. That was his greatest attribute, I think.
I think that's what you say is absolutely correct. And in my view, given the world we live in now, I sincerely hope that our leadership learns something from the need for that kind of listening to different points of view. Because let's face it, the global situation is highly uncertain.
Right.
Established, what used to be the established practices, good practices, are being questioned in the West.
Of course.
Geopolitics is fragmenting the world economy.
The WTO
is practically non-functional. Climate change is a huge challenge.
That's correct.
And
the Western world is not willing to fund.
Yeah, but at the same time, this is the point. We need to get out of the kind of tutu meme sort of thing and find out what common ground is there. Because I do believe there will be common ground. You need that Manmohan Singh type of approach.
Oh, I agree.
No point sort of coming there with a predetermined formula and expecting the world to listen.
Well, there are no predetermined formulas for any problem in life.
That's especially the point, because I think more than in the past. See, when the economic reforms were done in 1991, it was quite clear that the policies we were following were completely out of date. The world was going in a particular direction. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There was only one thing to do.
Right.
The only point was you had to persuade your own guys that's the way to go. That's tough, and he did a wonderful job.
That's correct.
But today, there's genuine uncertainty.
Today, in fact, I think the situation is far more complicated.
Yes, absolutely.
You have AI coming into the picture. That's going to destabilize our employment sector big time, I think.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And we don't know how to deal with it.
Yes.
We don't even have a policy on AI, right? There is no thinking on it. In the meantime, there's not enough investment in education. I remember, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh even quoted what Ambedkar said in 1925. He said, we can give up all material things, but the one thing we cannot give up is equal opportunity for education.
Yes.
Right? But we're not doing enough on it. We're not doing enough on the health sector. And he was very keen on both these sectors.
Actually, in one of the important things he did, when he was finance minister, there was too much to do to just fix the economy.
Right.
It was a crisis, you had to fix all those things. By the time he became prime minister, that had been more taken care of. The economy was moving ahead. his most important contribution there was to create a consensus which led subsequent governments also to do the right thing.
That's what happened.
That's not easy, because had he just politicized it somehow, then the next government that came would have wanted to undo. Well, they didn't. It was kind of continuity
I don't
with
think
change.
they could, because the kind of policies we followed, where you have growth, but without equity, without distribution.
I think, that is what came out very sharply when he became Prime Minister of the UPA, because there was a perception that, look, we weren't getting enough equity.
That's correct.
We had got over the crisis, also some growth was coming, not enough equity. And I think in the UPA, the focus shifted, quite rightly in my view, to some major initiatives that would lead to more equitable outcomes.
Absolutely.
Some better policies on agriculture, some very good policies, things like NREGA, which sort of created a bit of a floor for agricultural labor.
No,
And of
Aadhaar.
course,
The Aadhaar.
that a little later, Aadhaar. Absolutely, because
that's a game changer.
2009, I think, is when we were going to have such a national identity, but the game changer was bringing in Nanda Nilekani.
That's correct.
So in other words, there were people wanting to do it in the traditional way.
Right.
He brought in Nanda Nilekani, who actually said, what you're doing is a wrong thing to do.
Correct.
And I'm going to turn it upside down.
Right.
He supported that, and we all tried to support it. Right. But that has become the basis of what we now see as an important strength, which is the digital public infrastructure, which is being built up.
That's right.
So I think you're right that in that whole period, and
your DBT, the direct benefit transfer scheme, was started
that was also 2013, I think it was announced that we want to do this, basically.
Correct. So that was taken forward. So I think that's why I said the foundations of a modern resurgent India were actually laid by him.
Yes.
And if you really look back, there is no other prime minister. All other prime ministers have been politicians.
Yeah, that's right.
He's the only
Well, I don't hold that.
No, I'm not holding it against anybody.
No,
I'm not holding it against anybody. But just tells you. I mean, look at our national movement. I mean, all the people who were part of that national movement were highly educated, right? People who were at the forefront of the national movement, right? Not that I hold anybody, I don't want to criticize anybody for being part or being the head of any country. But the fact of the matter is that we need meritorious people who will solve the problems of the country.
That's very important.
And unless you get those meritorious people in government, you're not being able to solve. I mean, why did Dr. Manmohan Singh give you a call and said, come back to India?
Yeah, I mean, I had left with the approval of the then government, because they appointed me head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, a new office.
Right, okay.
And when I called up Dr. Singh to congratulate him on his becoming Prime Minister, he said on the phone, you better come right back. So I said, you tell me when and I'll come.
But that shows that he was looking
team
for...
building.
Yeah, I'm looking at his vision. I mean, we're trying to assess the man. That he was looking for meritorious people, people who had, domain knowledge in the area that they worked in. And that's why your example of asking Raghuram Rajan for his views.
Yes.
To find out, what's the best solution? Because economics is not a science. Right? You can have any number of ways to get at the same end. Now, which is the best way to do it is really the issue.
That's actually the crux of the economics problem, because you can approach it one way or you can approach it another way, and by making a series of assumptions, we can make it look as if this is the way to go or that is the way. But his background, I mean, he was very aware of this, if I may quote another relatively less known incident, because everyone focuses on Manmohan Singh when he was Prime Minister and Finance Minister. But he was also as a civil servant. Now, he couldn't do the same kind of earth-shattering changes, because as a civil servant, you're working within an existing system.
He was finance secretary.
Yes, but in that period, it's not true that he just didn't do anything really dramatic. When he was chief economic advisor, in 1973, there was a huge inflation.
Right.
And I think Mrs. Gandhi obviously was concerned, such a big inflation. She called the so-called top officials and technocrats together and said, what do we do to control it? Now, interestingly, the Planning Commission said that, the price of wheat is going up, we should nationalize the wheat trade. That was their approach, control. Manmohan said that, look, that's not going to work. It will just not work. If you really want to tackle inflation, you have no alternative but to use monetary and fiscal policy. And he told me that there was a discussion on this, and Mrs. Gandhi said to him that if I do what you're saying, are you going to guarantee that price inflation will go down? And he said, look, that when the Prime Minister asks you that question, there's an instinct to hum and haw, and nobody would blame you if you were to say, well, it depends on this and it depends on that. But he categorically said, yes, you do this, and within 1 year, I mean, he did say within 1 year, not tomorrow. It had gone to about 27%, and a year later it was -5. My suspicion, not that Mrs. Gandhi told me, or I mean, I wasn't even here, but I think that experience persuaded Mrs. Gandhi that Manmohan was a very special kind of technocrat.
He became a Reserve Bank of India governor.
Well, immediately later he became Secretary, Economic Affairs, and then all of those things. But you know, as Reserve Bank governor also, that's again kind of a civil service type of job, if you like. He played a very crucial role because there was a lot of pressure to give a license to the BCCI Bank, which was a Middle East-based bank with somewhat dubious kind of connections. And Manmohan didn't want to do it. And I mean, lots of people have said the finance ministry was quite keen on it. So what the finance minister at the time did was to move a cabinet note saying, why should the permission to open a bank rest with the Reserve Bank of India? It should be taken by the finance ministry, which will consult the Reserve Bank of India. And Dr. Singh conveyed that if that was done, he would resign.
Oh, really?
Yes. And Mrs. Gandhi didn't let it happen. Oh, wow. So the finance ministry. So, you know, even as...
most people don't know this at all.
Yeah, I hope I'm not being indiscreet. He told me this himself.
In fact, this is very important for people to know.
Yes.
The kind of man that he was.
Yeah. I mean, as Reserve Bank governor, I mean, you're not supposed to be micromanaging everything, and you're not supposed to be quarreling with the government on everything. But the point is, he felt that this business of giving licenses to a bank, if the Reserve Bank can't control that, the Reserve Bank can't do its job.
Well, that's the Banking
All you
Regulation
can offer
Act.
is say, I'll resign.
The Banking Regulation Act, mandates.
But they were going to amend it in order to change that power. So that was those are two what I remember. I'm sure there must have been others also. But then, of course, as finance minister, he really brought about a huge change. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that is what actually, if people think positively...
That's the legacy.
Yeah.
It's being carried on, yes, absolutely. But talking about the Governor Reserve Bank, I've heard somewhere that when Subbarao was appointed Governor Reserve Bank, he went to Manmohan Singh and asked him, look, what do you want me to do? He said, well, you've been in the system, you've been finance secretary, I don't have to tell you anything. So he kept quiet, and as he walked out of the room, he came along with him to see him off. And before he left, he apparently told him that when you're sitting there, you'll get involved in numbers and data, but think of the people who that's going to affect.
Yeah, he was very much...
He was behind all this data, behind all these numbers were people, which is why 271 million people were raised out of poverty.
That was the first time ever that the absolute number of the people below absolute poverty during the UPA period went up. But thinking about the people, I'm thinking of another incident which I'd like to share with you. I mean, I've mentioned it in my book Backstage. Computerization of the banks was a huge problem. I mean, we were very aware that this is in 1990, right? Everything had happened, email had just come in, the world was changing, but the public sector banks did not want to be computerized. So we were trying very hard to get them to computerize. And Dr. Singh wanted to do this in a consultative way. I think the managements were clear that it's necessary, but the unions were not. And when I say unions, I mean the Congress unions, the Communist unions, the BJP unions, all of them were against computerization. So what does Dr.
Even when Rajiv talked about it, and people used to laugh in Parliament at him when he walked in.
That's right. But anyway, it's one thing when you start, but when you get into banking, the point was made to the managing directors that, look, the private sector banks and the foreign banks are computerizing. If you don't computerize, they'll just get all the market.
Right.
So if you want a public sector bank to be efficient, you got to let them computerize. But the unions then objected. What does Dr. Manmohan Singh do? He called all the union leaders to a discussion in his room. As finance secretary, I happened to be there. And each one of them spoke totally against, said, no, this is going to reduce jobs. He told them, no, we will make sure that there's not a single job lost. Then they said, no, but it's going to prevent jobs from being created. Because with computerization, you won't need to hire so many people.
Right.
But then he would say, you won't be able to do the business because it'll go to the private sector bank. Right. Anyway, nobody was convinced. Then, as you said, he walked Subbarao to his door. That was his habit.
Yeah, right.
So as finance minister, he walked up to the door, and each of these trade union leaders, very distinguished and very senior men, he shook hands with them, thank you for coming, and that kind. I thought they were quite charmed by that, because normally the finance minister would get up and go to his desk and you'd troop out. Towards the end, one of the trade union leaders said to him, Mr. Finance Minister, I completely disagree with you on computerization, but I don't mind telling you, my son agrees with you. That was a very kind of realization that you need to talk to people, and when you talk to them in a frank kind of way, they themselves bring out. I mean, what this guy was saying is, look, I've got to say this. You do what you have to do, and my son agrees with you. I thought it was very bold of the trade union, very nice of him.
Yeah, that's a great story.
And someone like Dr. Manmohan Singh would have really appreciated that also.
But just look at his experience. Here is a man who I think worked with every prime minister, almost every prime minister.
Yeah.
During Janta period, he was there, right? Then, of course, during the Congress government, and he worked with VP Singh, with every opposition leader. So he had a sense of the politics. I mean, forget about the economics. He had a sense of the politics of this country.
Oh,
He
absolutely.
has worked with everybody,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Right? And that was a great advantage, that you were a technocrat and you have a sense of politics. So you know when you're going to run a coalition government, how you're going to navigate the problems of a coalition government.
Absolutely.
And I think that was again a signal achievement of a man who led a coalition government with ideological differences, right?
Yes.
And brought India a uniform growth rate of over 7.7% in the 10 years.
Yes.
I think that's a great achievement.
No, I agree with you. I think, frankly, when I was a student, we were used to explaining why is our growth rate so low, and we had hundreds of excuses that we could give. But sometime around the late 60s, it became clear that in East Asia, countries were growing very rapidly. It was clear to me, and certainly clear to many people outside, that our policies were all wrong. Yeah. When he changed policies in 91, a lot of the mindless criticism was, oh, this is just being done because of the World Bank. Yeah. But this is nonsense, because the critique of these policies was actually quite homegrown. After all, the first person to criticize these policies was Jagdish Bhagwati and his wife Padma Desai. Now, it's pity that they went off to America, but in the late 60s, they'd written the book that said, this is what we're doing is all wrong. Yeah. And even before them, there were critics. B.R. Shenoy was not in favor of what the second plan was doing. Okay. But somehow, I think we, by not encouraging the constant discussion and expressions of different points of view, I think we held it back. I mean, let me talk about myself as a student. We were not taught in Delhi that B.R. Shenoy had actually written a note of dissent on the second plan when it was referred to. Because he said there's too much deficit financing, too much reliance on state, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Panditji had invited Milton Friedman. Actually, now here's another example of consultation. He's normally viewed as a somewhat left-oriented, anti-Americans, but he invited Milton Friedman to come and visit the Planning Commission and to write a note for him.
At that stage?
In the 60s, yes.
Oh, I see.
And, I mean, either late 50s or early, just before he died.
Okay.
And Milton Friedman, who is the kind of the doyen of the monetarist market economy, he made a very interesting note. He said that, everybody thinks that Mahalanobis is very influential. Because Mahalanobis was the one who had put out the second plan model,
Right.
more investment in the public sector, in heavy industry, blah, blah, blah. He said that, I think people think Mahalanobis is very influential. I don't think so. I think he just tells the Prime Minister what he thinks the Prime Minister wants to hear.
Okay.
So this was one point. Second, he said, I think, and he wrote this in a memo which went to the government also,
Okay.
that India is too worried about setting up factories and so on. They should worry much more about education. Now, this is in the early 60s. Public thinks that it was not until Amartya Sen talked about it in the 1980s that people highlighted education. But Milton Friedman did that long. I think we need at any given time to make people aware that there are different viewpoints. And I think this is particularly...
Not the people, I think people are aware. It's the politician in this country.
No, I think the intellectual community was not adequately aware.
I mean, if the politician sets the trend, if you ask me, if the politician sets the trend, we start discussing real issues in this country.
Yeah, no,
right?
I have no...
That sets the agenda for the future.
No, the politician has a huge responsibility in encouraging a discussion of alternative points.
Because for every problem, there are alternative solutions.
Yeah.
And those will only come about if you have a discussion.
Yeah.
And in discussion, you should listen more and talk less.
Yes.
I mean, think about Dr. Manmohan Singh. He never politicized his background. Did you ever hear Dr. Manmohan Singh politicize his background? He would mention once in a while that he came from a small village, Gar, from this thing, and he studied in a small school there and all that. But he never politicized it. We in India seem to be politicizing everything. Right? I mean, no, that's unfortunate because it tells you the difference between a man who is really concerned about the people of the country rather than taking advantage of his or her background. And this is very important. People must realize that, at this position, we should be thinking about what we're going to do for people at the bottom of the pyramid. And there is no discussion on it.
No, we need more discussion on these. But this probably was always true, but it's doubly true now because the world's changing very rapidly, as we said earlier. So the uncertainty about what's the best way of going forward increases.
Look at when the Industrial Revolution came about, Europe, UK, the kind of problems you had. I mean, it took about 40, 50 years to get the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. Right?
Yeah.
The pollution, the instability it caused in the economy of those nations. We're going through the same process now. You're going to have a new age revolution that's going to take place. And this is going to destabilize us for the next several years. We need as a nation to be ready for that. And for that, we need a discussion.
No, I completely agree.
Nobody's talking about it.
And that's what we need. I agree.
Now tell me something, well, we've talked about so many things. Tell me how closely you worked with him when you were finance secretary for the reforms that were taking place at that time. And then your tenure as deputy chairman planning commission and what went on in the planning commission, because again, the states I thought were brought on board, right? I remember having several discussions with you in the planning commission. And you were constantly in touch with the states to say their problems. And I think that was, again, a part of a policy prescription when you looked at India in the context of the problems of separately for each state and then come up with solutions. I just want you to
Well, that's a very
about
interesting question. First, on the finance secretary. I mean, we had a very close relationship. He gave me complete access. I think people also knew that I had complete access to him, so nobody was trying to, as it were, do a side run. But complete access didn't mean that he didn't listen to other people.
Right.
So we would generally, in all matters related to the budget at least, we would discuss it with the finance minister and four of us, I mean, 3 secretaries and the chief economic advisor. I think that has got eroded since then.
Yeah.
But more than that, I mean, the interesting thing about the reforms at that time was a lot of the reforms had to do beyond just finance ministry. I mean, for example, if you're going to liberalize and allow industry to expand, you got to allow them to raise money. Right. And if they're going to raise money, you need the banks to be more liberal, you need the capital market to develop. If you develop the capital market, there's a question of bringing in foreign inflows.
That's correct. So all interconnected.
You had all those old-fashioned ideas of takeover, not takeover. Right. So actually we were operating on multiple fronts, and he was fully aware of this thing. And we would frequently go in and say, look, this is what we can do. And we more or less had a game plan.
Okay.
Next budget, we're going to do these things. And his whole approach was, on the financial side, rather than just outline something, he set up a committee under M. Narasimham, which had a few very, very distinguished people, including former bankers, and asked them to advise, what should we do? Then he made that report public. So, people could see where the thinking is going. Similarly on taxation, he set up the Tax Reforms Committee under Raja Chellaya, very distinguished fiscal economist, but that included some former revenue service official, retired senior people, also some industry people, some accountants. I mean, accountants are crucial on tax reform. By setting up an external committee, I think he got a fresh look. You can tell whatever you like to the internal system, but you cannot get a fresh look. Because if they've just produced a budget saying this is the most brilliant thing imaginable, you're not going to find them saying, oh, by the way, that's all wrong, do something different. So he brought these two, and it's very interesting. In his first budget, there were no significant changes in this area. Just a directional change that, look, we need to think about this. Then these two reports come out. In his second budget, he implements or starts implementing both of them. And they get announced. And at that time, we also gave a legal status to SEBI and sort of created that freedom in the capital market. Of course, we got hit by the Harshad Mehta scam, but he handled that extremely well. And I mean, there was a tendency on the part of the left at that time to think that the Harshad Mehta scam was actually due to liberalization. And not true at all. It was actually due to the non-transparency in the Reserve Bank, which enabled people to pull money out, speculate, and then give it back again. So any of those things could have been mishandled, but I think Dr. Singh managed to handle them well. And we managed, I think, to get quite a lot started.
Well, even in the 90s with those reforms, you had an average growth rate of 6%.
Yes. Yeah,
from a 3% prior to 1991, right?
But now you're saying about in the Planning Commission.
Yes.
I think, the job as Planning Commission is quite different because unlike other ministries, the Planning Commission doesn't actually have any executive power. Even in the allocation of funds, it's an advisory body in the sense that it tells the finance minister that this is what we think should happen. Finance minister may agree with some, not agree, and then the two go together to the PM, and the PM takes the final
But at least you lay the foundation, the lay of the land.
Yes, the advantage there was that we knew what the ministries wanted.
Correct.
And I think putting them together gave us a sense of the gap between expectations and resources.
Right.
Because every ministry comes forward with a proposal saying, I need 100,000 crores for the next 4 years.
We know that.
Okay, you know that. And the process was not that it went just to the finance ministry, it went to the planning commission. So they would ask for 100 and we would narrow it down to 80.
Correct.
Then we would go to the finance minister and he would say, you must be joking. So 80,
these are my resources,
the two of us
can't give possible.
He would say, okay, I'll go to 70, and I would say, no, at least 75. Then we would go to the
PM. Then there are
PM.
priorities involved.
Yeah, exactly. And he would make the final decision.
Right.
So for the PM, the Planning Commission was, if you like, a spokesperson.
Or a sounding board.
Well, yeah, it could be. We like to think of it as the spokesperson for more capital expenditure. Okay. And rightly, the finance ministry would be saying, look, it's all very good, but if we don't have the money, you'll just destabilize the economy. Correct. So the Prime Minister was always aware that the two principal technocrats he's put in charge are taking a different view.
Right.
And it's his call. What do you do? And that I think was useful. Now the states is I feel that, we did interact a lot with the states. We met every state. And frankly, the little states were quite appreciated what we did. Partly because we were able to give them advice, and they didn't necessarily have access to that advice. The larger states, I think, felt that, look, somebody from Tamil Nadu, whom I knew very well, a civil servant, told me the right thing. He said, why do you put conditionality on the money you give? Actually, it was very weak conditionality, because we always gave the money in the end. She said, look, give us the money and separately give us a lecture. And if we like your lecture, we listen to you. That's actually what used to happen, because the deputy chairman had very little flexibility. Only about 10% of the total was distributed on the basis of whatever the deputy chairman felt was necessary. Otherwise, it was a formula-driven thing.
Let me just move away from this and ask you a simple question.
But the main point I wanted to make there was the bigger states tended to feel that the only usefulness of the Planning Commission is if they can give us more money.
More money, yes.
And the point is, the money they needed was so huge that within the flexibility we had, we could never satisfy them.
Possible.
But I think they enjoyed, on the whole, they benefited from a critical review of the state's performance.
But that doesn't happen in Niti Aayog nowadays.
No, I think that function doesn't exist
This is
anymore.
unfortunate, because you can never get the state's point of view.
Well, they can consult the state. What you're saying is the states don't take it seriously.
No.
Because this way they think they're getting some money.
No, at least there are conversations that are happening continually.
Yes.
That's what's important.
We used to, once a year, there was a conversation at official level, then between the deputy chairman and the chief minister, and we would report back to the PM. And
So
sometimes the
let
CM
me
would
ask
meet the
you,
PM.
just move away a bit. Do you think under the present federal structure, the states need more financial autonomy?
I am convinced that they do.
They do. But that's important. I mean, I think for the future.
You've got to remember, we're running a country where the richest state has a per capita income which is 5 times the poorest state.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So it's a very disparate group of people.
Right.
Now, we have some autonomy given to them through the Finance Commission, some percentage of tax revenue, etc. Otherwise, actually, I personally feel the real problem, if you go deep enough, you need to review the distribution of powers in the state list.
Yes.
I personally think that the concurrent list is a dubious concept.
I agree entirely. That's what I was coming to.
Yeah, no, it is a dubious concept, straight away. Yeah. I mean, take, for example, education.
Why should education be in the concurrent
No
list?
reason
Or
at
health,
all.
or
And,
health.
well, I'll tell you why it started. Because in those days, the Planning Commission, Central Government Planning Commission, would give sectoral grants. So in order to give grants to the schools, to the school system, they wanted it to be in the concurrent list, because then they could prescribe the conditions.
Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan is that.
I think that's wrong.
No,
we should
I
give the
agree.
money,
Yeah.
and we should conduct seminars.
You should respect the states and think that, when they have the money, they were going to spend it, because ultimately they'll have to get re-elected. If
You
they don't
can't guarantee that, but if they don't, they'll see the results.
That's right. So they will, willy-nilly, they will in fact compete with each other, if you ask me.
Yes.
Which is a good thing.
Yes,
And I think this is all wrong. We need to revisit this whole concurrent list business.
I would agree with that.
And also,
I should confess, by the way, that when I was in government, I didn't say so.
Okay.
Because at that, when you're there, you always think this is the system, we can run it well or we can run it better. But being outside and having been outside for 10 years, I mean, if there's one thing we need to change is the concurrent list arrangement.
What about the borrowing capacity of the states?
The what?
Borrowing capacity.
My view on elsewhere, irresponsible borrowing by the states has very often been a source of major crises.
Correct.
Okay? Now, technically, in India, the states cannot borrow except with the permission of the central government. Okay? Now, there are two problems here.
The Reserve Bank of India also has control over that.
Not really, because once the central government has said you can borrow, then it becomes incumbent on the Reserve Bank to make sure they facilitate.
They take
right?
the advice of the Reserve Bank on that. This is what I've seen in the recent past.
Well, you see, the problem is they don't take state-by-state advice. The usual approach is that, for example, many finance ministers, including from the previous government, would say that centre's deficit should be so much, state's deficit should be whatever, 2.5%. But
but
actually,
the center overborrows.
center overborrows.
This is the problem. The center overborrows.
Yes.
The states can't borrow because they want the deficit to be.
But what is worse is the states borrowing is a kind of a uniform rate for all states. Now that doesn't make sense.
That's right.
If a state is rapidly growing, it can be allowed to borrow more.
Exactly.
If its debt to GDP ratio is low, it can be allowed to borrow more.
Exactly.
If it's slow growing with a high debt to GDP,
Then
it should
of
be low.
course.
But they don't do that.
Yeah. But you can monitor that.
Because
the point is that we need to
No,
change.
I tell you how that avoided. The states set up other public sector units and they borrow.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
the real problem is the banks, your public sector banks, they view that as sovereign debt. Now, if we privatize the banking system, this will stop.
Yeah, this will stop.
But as long as 60% of our banking system is actually public sector, and they happily lend to the states because they think it's sovereign debt.
That's correct.
So unless some
I think some tweaking has to be done there. We need to relook at that as well.
Another case for a really expert committee of lawyers, economists, and governance people.
No, but this is the point I'm making. If we had a Dr. Manmohan Singh today, these things would have been looked at. These discussions would have happened, because he was always a man who thought of the future.
Yeah, I think we need to, you're exactly right, that looking ahead for India, how we are going to impose any kind of fiscal discipline combined with autonomy.
Right.
I mean, fiscal discipline should be, non-negotiable.
Yeah, absolutely.
But autonomy should also be complete. I mean, if this is your money, you spend it the way you like.
Spend the way you want, absolutely.
And if the people you serve don't approve of that, they'll vote you out. That's exactly right.
Yes, exactly.
But I think it's understandable in the first period after independence, there's a kind of patronizing, paternalistic approach. You can't let the states kind of go all over the place. But if we are going to become the fourth largest economy very soon, we cannot continue
That really
this.
doesn't mean too much, Monty, according to me. You may be the fourth largest economy. Your real problem is the levels of poverty in this country. Your per capita income is...
per capita income is still low. No, but what I mean is
even
that's...
BRICS countries.
But the thing is that my guess is we have less fiscal discipline than other developing countries do. If you count all the hidden borrowing.
Yes,
that's
true.
The total deficit of the center and the states together is something of the order of 8% or so of GDP.
Yeah.
Then you put in the kind of stuff that the states do via their public sector.
Yeah, it gets...
Elsewhere, the fiscal deficit is 3.5, 3.
That's true.
We are more than twice the developing country range. And frankly, if we want to attract foreign investment, this is one of the numbers everybody looks at.
That's true.
Now, it's good that we are growing well. Maybe people feel we'll keep on growing. The moment that slows down, or the moment there's a problem.
There's a problem with the numbers also, whether you are going well as well.
Yes, that's a fair point.
Problem.
But the basic point is, if you were to ask the question to me, is India's fiscal situation a potential problem? I would say it is. And the trouble is, addressing that problem will require some very fundamental changes.
Fundamental changes and a man of the stature and of the quality of Dr. Manmohan Singh. Right?
Yeah, we need lots more of
Dr.
thinking,
Manmohan Singh for this country.
That can all
I
agree
remember in the first speech he made when he came to power from Lal Killa, he said, कि मैं आपको कोई वादे करने नहीं आया हूँ, मैं वादे निभाने आया हूँ. Right? That's the kind of man he was. We were having this conversation in the context of the fact that the nature of the polity and the nature of the country has changed. What Manmohan Singh did is still being carried on, but for the reforms that he initiated in the 90s and the reforms that he brought about when he was Prime Minister during the 10 years. That's the momentum for whatever is happening. That provided the momentum for what's happening in the country today. So we close this discussion by telling ourselves it was a great privilege for both of us to have served under him. And we wish that people like him should be at the helm of the country to take it forward and make it a great nation. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot.